This year marks the 60th anniversary of Pope St Paul VI declaring St Benedict to be the Patron of Europe. He did this as he was rededicating the Abbey Church at Monte Cassino, the monastery founded by St Benedict, where both he and his sister St Scholastica lie buried. In 1944, this monastery and its church had been reduced to rubble by military action during the Second World War, a destruction that was commonly felt by Italians to be a symbol of the damage brought about by the war, a symbol not simply of physical damage, but of the moral damage that the war had brought to Italy, and not just the war, but the unjust regime of its fascist rulers who led them into war. 20 years afterwards, on the 24th of October 1964, the church had been reconstructed, and the Pope himself had come to rededicate it. Paul VI saw this as a symbol of the post-war reconstruction not just of Italy, but of the whole of Europe, and used the occasion not just to make a simple declaration that St Benedict was to be Patron of Europe, but to reflect on why he was a suitable patron for this continent. His text of the speech he made when declaring St Benedict to be Patron of Europe begins with the words Pacis Nuncius, messenger of peace. In the context of the time, the desire for peace made this an obvious beginning point amid efforts to build peace in Europe after the disastrous conflicts of the preceding century, of which, of course, the rubble of 1944 was a symbol. And as we look around our own continent and well, there are so many images of rubble in the Ukraine which remind us of the destruction that war brings in our own day. We need today a messenger of peace. The Pope went on to describe the saint as one who formed union and taught civilization. But the greatest of his titles was that he was a herald of the religion of Christ and founder of monastic life in the West. These last two titles point to how St Benedict can still be a patron of Europe 60 years after the rededication of Monte Cassino. St Paul VI identified three symbols for the way in which St Benedict and the monastic movement to which he gave rise carried the gospel of Christ across Europe: the cross, the book, and the plow. By the cross, the Pope explained he meant the law of Christ, which gave order to both public and private life. Above all, the cross taught the people of Europe the primacy of divine worship through liturgical and ritual prayer, what St Benedict called the Opus Dei in his rule. It was this prayer which cemented a spiritual unity in Europe, which enabled peoples divided on the levels of language, ethnicity and culture to feel themselves to constitute the one people of God. That great title, the people of God, would shortly form the centrepiece of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council on the nature of the Church. Commenting on St Benedict in 2008, Pope Benedict XVI said, "Having recently emerged from a century that was deeply wounded by 2 world wars and the collapse of the great ideologies, now revealed as tragic utopias, Europe today is in search of its own identity. Of course, in order to create new and lasting unity, political, economic and legal instruments are important. But it is also necessary to awaken an ethical and spiritual renewal which draws on the Christian roots of the continent. Otherwise, the new Europe cannot be built. The image of roots is important, and Pope Benedict draws it out by referring later to the sap that rises from these roots. His image does not simply give us a history lesson, but rather the idea of a plant which needs continual nourishment if it is not to die. The Gospel is precisely that nourishment for Europe. Paul VI's second image is that of the book. Paul himself was a man richly formed by the tradition of classical literature, but his description of the sons of St Benedict preserving the literary patrimony of classical antiquity is more than just a bibliophile's appreciation. He reminded his listeners in 1964 that knowledge is something that has to be cultivated and worked at. More than that, true knowledge is something at which we can meaningfully aim. The true is within our human reach, and also, all truth is one. So the monks confidently preserved the wisdom of the ancients, along with the work of the first theologians of the Church, because they knew that all truth came from God and led in its turn back to God. In our own day, when so many question the possibility of truth in human affairs and express suspicion of attempts to integrate human knowledge into a bigger picture, the quiet work of the medieval monks calls us back to that vision of life which is illuminated by God in all its details. The integration of faith and reason and the reconciliation of the destructive conflicts between them, so much a theme of the teaching of Benedict XVI, another lover of St Benedict, also finds a source of inspiration in this monastic commitment to the book, offering us a picture of how faith and reason work together in harmony. The final image Pope St Paul VI uses is that of the plow, to stand for, as he says, the cultivation of the fields that succeeded in transforming wastelands into fertile fields and gracious gardens. One of Paul's great concerns was the problem of feeding the huge number of people in the world of his day who were starving. He recognised the role that agriculture had to play in that task, and still has to play today, to feed the still vast numbers who are hungry in our own world. But his vision of the plough points to more. He looks not just to fertile fields, but to gracious gardens. We can put this into the language of Pope Francis and see how he is evoking the creation of a common home. In that home, the need for the beauty of nature to be available in gardens is important alongside the need for food. In ways that the early monks could not have imagined, the notion of a common home which feeds everyone without destroying the planet can be inspired by their work, as their monasteries had both fields for crops and gardens in the cloisters at the heart of the monastery. How might this happen? Pope Paul spoke of the monks uniting prayer with their manual labour. And this openness to the will of God in prayer is the only secure pathway to finding a way to realise the vision of a common home. When Pope Paul spoke about human work being ennobled and elevated, he identified the essential element that goes into care for the environment, that contact through prayer with God, which means that both the worker and the task are raised up to share in bringing about God's plan. Human work points to another theme touched on by Pope Paul, the work of bringing about order and justice in society. The point made by the Holy Father is a subtle one. He praises St Benedict for inspiring in the peoples of Europe the loving care of order and justice that forms the foundation of true society. It is not enough to have the right ideas about justice and about that order on which society can be based. It's necessary, but not enough. And similarly, it's necessary, but not enough, even to work hard to bring this about. That hard work which the Pope summed up in the word care. The adverb is important. This work of bringing about a just order must be loving. It must be animated by the love of neighbour Christ described, which St Benedict showed towards the monks in his own community, and which he laid down in his rule as the standard for the abbot to measure up to. Benedict could display this love because he had faced and overcome the temptations that every human faces and must overcome. As Pope Benedict says of him, having tranquilized his soul, he could be in full control of the drive of his ego and thus create peace around him. So can St Benedict's monastery be a picture for Europe? When we speak of building a just social order, the monastery reminds us that the first and indispensable commitment of a disciple of St Benedict is the sincere search for God, on the path mapped out by the humble and obedient Christ, love of whom he must put before all else. And in this way, in serving others, the monk becomes a man of service and peace. In the exercise of obedience, practiced by faith, inspired by love, the monk achieves humility, to which, of course, the rule dedicates an entire chapter. In this way, each monk conforms ever more to Christ and attains true self-fulfillment as a creature in the image and likeness of God. The obedience of the disciple must correspond with the wisdom of the abbot, who in the monastery is believed to hold the place of Christ. The figure of the abbot, which is described above all in chapters 2 and 64 of the Rule, which contain a profile of spiritual beauty and demanding commitment, can be considered a self-portrait of St Benedict himself, since, as Gregory the Great wrote, the holy man could not teach otherwise than as he himself lived. The abbot must be at the same time a tender father and a strict teacher, a true educator. Inflexible against vices, he is nevertheless called above all to imitate the tenderness of the Good Shepherd, to serve rather than to rule, in order to show them all, the monks that is, what is good and holy by his deeds more than by his words, and illustrate the divine precepts by his example. To be able to decide responsibly, the abbot must also be a person who listens to the brethren's views, because the Lord often reveals to the youngest what is best. Words for followers and leaders. The Rule provides both. This last provision, about revealing to the youngest what is best, makes a rule written almost 15 centuries ago surprisingly modern. A man with public responsibility, even in small circles, must always be a man who can listen and learn from what he hears. St Benedict was a man who could listen and could learn from what he heard. This is not the least of the reasons why he remains an ideal patron for Europe, facing as it does the many problems and difficulties which we know only too well. As we prepare to play our part in resolving them, let us pray to St Benedict as Patron of Europe for his aid as we do so.